So I was reading a translation of the Kojiki the other day. It's Japan's oldest surviving book, finished way back in 712 AD.
Right, a foundational text.
Exactly. And you expect, old stories, kings, battles, and it has all that. But then you get to the official genealogy, and it traces the very first emperor, Jimmu, right back in this supposedly unbroken line to his great-great-grandmother, who is the sun goddess Amaterasu.
Yeah, not a metaphor.
Not a metaphorical sun king, no, but the literal sun. And for centuries, this wasn't just like folklore. It was the actual foundational story of the state, the official proof that the imperial line was divine and the nation itself was sacred.
It's an incredibly potent idea.
That detail just really stuck with me. It's such a powerful concept. It really makes you wonder, what is a nation, actually? Is it just the land you live on? Is it shared ancestry? Or is it maybe just a really compelling story that everyone kind of agrees to be part of?
Well, that compelling story, that foundation myth rooting the state right up in the heavens, that's arguably the most powerful tool in the whole nationalist toolbox, isn't it?
It seems like it.
I mean, the journey from Amaterasu down to Emperor Jimmu, it gave Japan this perceived essence, this purity and uniqueness that lasted really for over 1,000 years.
Right.
But the thing that's truly fascinating here for our deep dive today is that this ancient narrative, this divinely constructed identity, it wasn't static.
Okay.
It's fundamentally a political instrument. And it's been repeatedly tuned, retooled over the last 1,300 years.
Okay.
Especially in the modern era, which was so turbulent. You had military defeat, foreign occupation. This narrative wasn't just broken. It was strategically re-engineered, really deliberately, to serve entirely new political and even geopolitical goals.
So that's what we're focusing on, how this story got manipulated.
Exactly. We're going to trace that evolution. We'll look at the mythological bedrock, sure, but then really analyze the surprising, continuous, and often quite unexpected political role the emperor played, especially in navigating defeat after World War II and constructing Japan's modern post-war identity.
Okay, let's definitely unpack that foundational story first then. Because you're right, you can't really get the massive political shifts of the 20th century without understanding the sheer gravitational pull of this divine genealogy. So where do we start with the sort of political engineering that's baked into these earliest myths?
We start right at the beginning, literally the beginning of everything. The Genesis myths, which you find mainly in the Kojiki and the Nihon Shoki, they weren't just stories. They were effectively foundational political texts.
How so?
Well, they established not just geography, but political hierarchy right from the get-go. It starts with the primordial couple, Izanagi and Izanami. They're the gods commissioned to create the land.
The ones with the spear on the bridge.
That's them. They stand on the floating bridge of heaven. They stir the sort of chaotic waters below with a jeweled spear. And when they lift it, the drops falling back create the first landmass, Onagoro Island.
And from there, they literally give birth to the nation itself, the islands.
Precisely. They physically give birth to the 8 main islands of Japan, the Oyashimakuni. And alongside them, countless nature deities, gods of the sea, the wind, mountains, trees, you name it.
So the land itself is divine, inherently.
Absolutely, which is politically very useful later on. Now, the story takes a really critical political turn when Izanami dies, giving birth to the god of fire. Izanagi is heartbroken, goes down into Yomi, the underworld, to get her back.
Fails, right. Sees her decaying form.
Fails dramatically. He flees in terror, seals the entrance to the underworld, and then needs to purify himself from the pollution, the Kegar of the land of the dead.
And that purification act, that's the key moment for the imperial line, isn't it?
It is. It's the Genesis moment. Because when Izanagi washes the filth of the underworld away in a river, 3 of the most important deities are born from his body. From his left eye, the sun goddess, Amaterasu Shimikami. The big one. From his right eye, the moon god, Tsukuyomi. And from his nose, the storm god, the unruly Susanoo. And crucially, Amaterasu is immediately commanded by Izanagi, her divine father, to rule Takamagahara, the celestial plains, which is the mythological way of saying Japan.
Okay, hang on. I want to pause on that detail. You said Amaterasu is the ultimate source of imperial legitimacy, the most revered deity. But she's born from and then commanded by a male god, Izanagi. What's the political significance there? Is there one?
Oh, absolutely. It's incredibly important if you want to understand the patriarchy that's woven right into the imperial structure from the start.
Huh.
So while Amaterasu is the sun, the ultimate source of divine authority, the original authority is patriarchal. Izanagi sets the order, he tells her what to do.
Okay.
This layering ensures that even though the imperial line comes from the sun goddess, the political and social structure of the nation stays fundamentally male-dominated. It enforces a specific kind of hierarchy right from the cosmic beginning.
Right. So Amaterasu is ruling the heavens, the celestial planes, and then the power, the legitimacy transfers down that divine chain, connecting the gods to, eventually, history.
Exactly right. Legitimacy flows from Izanagi, it gets solidified by Amaterasu, and then it's transferred down through her descendants. The first human emperor, Jimmu Tenno, who's traditionally said to have founded the empire around 660 BC.
Yeah.
He's considered a direct descendant of Amaterasu. And this line, crucially, has been historically promoted as never having been broken. An unbroken dynasty stretching back to the gods.
And the political impact of that claim is just immense.
Profoundly political. Because the emperor, the Tenno, he isn't just a political ruler, like a king or president. He is a holy human being. He's literally a kami, a divinity.
Which means political dissent isn't just disagreeing with policy.
It's inherently a spiritual failing.
Yes.
In this constructed reality, any contradiction, any revolt against the emperor's authority, that's considered outright blasphemy. It's a revolt against the will of the very gods who created the islands and set up the whole hierarchy. And what's more, this holiness doesn't just stop with the emperor. Because he's the direct divine descendant, the Japanese people themselves, through him, are also considered derived from the gods. They share in that divinity, albeit to a lesser degree.
Okay, and this is where we get to that core ideological concept, the Kazoku Koka, the family nation idea. If everyone shares this divine root through the emperor, they're all related.
That's the entire ideological structure right there. The key consequence of this shared divine origin is that all Japanese people are naturally brothers and sisters. It creates this powerful concept of a unified, homogeneous nation, a single, massive, divinely sanctioned family unit.
And the emperor's role in that family?
He's positioned at the very center. He's the purest person among pure people, the holy father of the nation. And this whole ideology is cemented with absolute patriarchy.
So obedience is just natural.
It's understood as the natural, unquestioning obedience of children to their father. The emperor is the father. The nation are his children. This concept was incredibly useful for social control, for national mobilization. It made any external criticism or even internal fragmentation seem inherently unnatural, like a betrayal of the family itself.
It's a really genius piece of political framing, isn't it? Making disunity feel fundamentally wrong, like you're betraying your own kin. I'm also really interested in how this whole narrative connects down to something as basic as food, because the sources mention this cosmology is deeply tied to rice.
Oh, absolutely. This is one of the most, I'd say, brilliant parts of the political mythology. The Japanese cosmology is profoundly based on rice culture. It establishes this deep sacred link between the land, the people, the gods, and their sustenance. And the key myth here is about Ukemochi no Kami, the goddess of food.
Right, I remember reading that one. Amaterasu's brother, Susanoo, kills her because he's disgusted by how she serves food, pulling it out of her orifices.
Exactly. She produces food from her mouth, nose, rectum. Susanoo, who's always impulsive and kind of violent, sees this as an insult and kills her on the spot.
Grim.
Very. But Amaterasu, despite being upset, recognizes the vital importance of this source of food. So from Ukemochi's dead body, she retrieves various essential things needed for human life. Millet from her forehead, silkworms from her eyebrows, and, critically, rice grains from her belly.
Ah, the rice from the belly.
Yes. And Amaterasu declares that these things must be used by humanity for its survival. So this myth establishes rice not just as a crop, but as a sacred gift directly from the highest deity, Amaterasu. The entire population is therefore indebted to the gods for their very existence, their daily food.
And that reinforces the emperor's role, too.
Absolutely. He becomes the chief priest, the steward of this divine sustenance, the one who performs the rituals to ensure the harvest continue. It links him directly to the people's survival.
And this connection to rice, the sacred gift, it actually elevates the social position of the farmer, the person handling it, more than, say, merchants.
It does. It fundamentally shapes the traditional social hierarchy. Within the Japanese class system, samurai, farmer, artisan, merchant, the peasant rank was historically considered higher than the merchant rank.
Why?
Because the peasants were the direct producers of this sacred source of life, the rice. They were perceived as somehow uncontaminated, working directly with the gift of the gods. Merchants, on the other hand, were often seen as corrupted because they dealt with mere money, with trade, which was viewed as a less pure, less fundamental pursuit.
So the mythology provides a spiritual backbone for the importance of agriculture and even gives a kind of moral superiority to the rural population.
Precisely. It anchors the nation's identity in the soil and the sacred crop.
Now, this sounds like a narrative that could be, well, weaponized, politically speaking, whenever society feels fragmented or maybe contaminated by outside ideas. And we see that happen, right? Long before the modern era, back in the 18th century.
Yes, exactly. This is the first major political revival of these ideas. Starting in the 18th century, you get this wave of thinkers, known as the National Learning School, or Kokugaku. And the key figure here is Moturi Norinaga.
Okay.
He and his followers initiated this really powerful intellectual movement aimed at revitalizing these ancient foundation myths. And their agenda was profoundly political. They explicitly wanted to turn the Japanese society back to the origins.
Back to this pure divine beginning.
Yes, and crucially, to purify the society from foreign effects.
What kind of foreign effects were they worried about back then?
Primarily the pervasive influence of Chinese philosophy, especially Confucianism and also Buddhist cults and practices. Even the complexity of Chinese characters used in written Japanese was seen as a sort of corruption.
So they felt these foreign systems had weakened Japan.
Norinaga argued exactly that. He felt these foreign systems had corrupted the pure kokoro, the heart or spirit of the Japanese people, and were partly responsible for what they saw as the chaos and decay of the later Tokugawa shogunate era. His followers really strongly believed that these foundation myths proved Japan's primacy, its spiritual superiority, because its foundation was uniquely native and divine, unlike, say, China's, which they saw as based more on human philosophy.
So their goal was essentially to strip away centuries of foreign influence, Chinese, Buddhist, to reveal this pure native political system. And the emperor was key to that.
Absolutely central. They strongly advocated for the revival of pure Shinto, the native way. And the aim was clearly to create an ideological base for the idea of a powerful, centralizing, mighty emperor. They did this by reinforcing the holiness, the uniqueness of the Tento.
And this intellectual movement actually had real-world consequences.
Hugely significant ones. Many historians credit this Kokugaku movement as being a primary ideological trigger, or at least providing the essential groundwork for the Meiji Restoration in 1868. That restoration overthrew the shogunate and reestablished the emperor as the core of modern national power.
Right, but then later on in the Meiji period itself, you see a kind of parallel but maybe slightly contrasting line of thought. Someone like Yanagita Kunio, he was also looking for purity, but not quite in the same place as the scholars or the imperial court.
That's a really important nuance, yeah. Yanagita Kunio was basically the founder of Japanese folklore studies, Minzoku-gaku, also believed in the uniqueness of Japan and was searching for that purity. But he assumed that this purity could now only be found in the traditional practices, the language, the beliefs of common peasants, especially those in remote, isolated villages.
Why?
In Yanagita's view, the cosmopolitan elite, the writers, the philosophers, even those national learning scholars like Moturi, they were the ones who are now contaminated by foreign influences, whether it was Chinese learning in the past or increasingly modern Western ideas and culture.
So for him, the peasant, the farmer working the land.
The uncontaminated producer of that sacred gift of rice, working the divine landscape. That was the true repository of authentic Japanese identity. Not the emperor necessarily or the intellectuals, but the folk.
So you have these two competing or maybe complementary ideas of where the true Japanese spirit resides, either in the divine, unbroken imperial line at the top or in the uncorrupted agricultural purity of the common people at the bottom. Both seem like powerful tools for nationalism.
They really are. You could say they're two sides of the same Kazoku Koka coin, in a way. Both rely fundamentally on this idea of inherent shared purity, just located differently. And this kind of thinking leads us directly to the modern and often quite rigid concept of Japanese identity, Minzoku.
Okay, tell us more about Minzoku. It gets translated as ethnicity or nation, but you're saying in the Japanese context, it carries a much stricter, more loaded meaning.
Yeah, Minzoku is complex. It essentially formalizes this idea of unity by implying there's a necessary, perfect match between two key components. What's often called Japanese blood, meaning genes, perceived ancestry in Japanese culture, or bunka.
Blood and culture have to match perfectly.
That's the ideal, the illusion maker effect, as some scholars call it. Even though, modern science shows the Japanese population is actually quite diverse, genetically, paragenetic is the term, with origins incorporating genes from people from the Kuriles, Sakhalin, ancient Koreans, the indigenous Ainu, and others. Despite that reality, the deep-seated ideological belief in the Minzoku maintains this powerful illusion of absolute homogeneity, of pureness.
And the consequence of this really rigid definition, if you lack one of those components, the right genes or the right culture, you're kind of permanently outside the inner circle.
That is often the social and political consequence, yes. Think about an individual who has Japanese ancestry, maybe they're third-generation Japanese-American or Japanese-Brazilian. They might look Japanese, have the blood, but were raised entirely abroad.
Right.
They might even speak Japanese perfectly, but they lack that deep, subtle cultural context, the shared assumptions and behaviors that come from being raised in the Japanese islands. Often, they find they can't be accepted as totally Japanese. They lack the bunka aspect in its deepest sense.
And the reverse.
The reverse is also true. Consider someone of, say, ethnic Korean descent. The Zainichi Koreans, whose family might have been in Japan for generations. They were born there, raised entirely in Japan, speak only Japanese, follow Japanese customs perfectly.
But they lack the blood component.
Exactly. They lack the perceived genetic component, so they can struggle to be seen as entirely Japanese within that Minzoku framework. For that ideal, pure Japaneseness, the genes and the culture have to align perfectly. And this ideology of the Minzoku, this imagined homogeneity, really defined the nation right up until 1945.
Which brings us right to that profound reconfiguration you mentioned earlier. Emperor Hirohito inherited this whole complex system, this political and spiritual foundation. He was born a living god, prepared from childhood to be the absolute center of political, social, religious life. But then, in 1945, this whole divine narrative just slams headfirst into the brutal reality of total military defeat and foreign occupation.
1945, that was the moment of absolute existential crisis for the imperial household and for that whole narrative. Before the 1930s and the war, Emperor Hirohito was the apex of power, absolutely central to the militarist regime's propaganda. But the loss of the war and the external threat from the victorious allies was immediate and terrifyingly real.
How direct was the threat to him personally?
Very direct. The Potsdam Declaration issued by the Allies explicitly called for the removal of those leaders who had deceived and led the Japanese people into embarking on world conquest.
Yeah.
That pointed straight at the emperor. And U.S. public opinion was overwhelmingly hostile. There are records, for instance, of an unpublished Gallup poll from June 1945.
Yeah.
A staggering 77% of Americans demanded that Hirohito be tried as a war criminal.
77%. Wow. So the U.S. occupation forces, led by General MacArthur, they arrived facing this impossible choice, didn't they? Satisfy that public demand, maybe dismantle the whole imperial institution, or keep it intact for stability. What was the strategic thinking there?
Ultimately, it was pure pragmatism that won out. The U.S. leadership, particularly people in the State Department and the War Department back in Washington, recognized a crucial strategic imperative. It came down to that very Kazoku Koka concept we talked about.
The family nation, how did that factor in?
They realized that the absolute obedience the Japanese people showed towards the emperor, derived from that family nation idea, could be incredibly useful. Preserving the imperial household, even in a dramatically diminished capacity, was seen as essential for a smooth occupation, for efficient disarmament of millions of soldiers, and for maintaining political stability.
So getting rid of the emperor might actually cause more problems for the occupiers.
Exactly. They feared chaos, maybe prolonged resistance, possibly even the complete fragmentation of the society they needed to manage and eventually rebuild as an ally. Keeping the emperor, using his authority, seemed like the safer, more efficient path.
And Hirohito himself clearly understood his own utility in this situation. His surrender message, the famous radio broadcast on August 15th, 1945, that wasn't just giving up.
No, not at all. That speech was really a masterpiece of political maneuvering, cleverly disguised as capitulation. It was delivered over the radio the very first time the general public had ever heard his voice, which was shocking in itself.
Right.
And it was fundamentally a direct call for order. By urging the people to endure the unendurable, to continue as one family from generation to generation, and critically not to lose the confidence of the world, he was effectively using the immense symbolic weight of the monarchy to instruct the public to cooperate fully with the incoming occupation authority.
So the message was, obey the Americans to save the nation, and by implication, save the imperial family.
That was precisely the subtext. Both Hirohito and the U.S. leadership quickly recognized their mutual need. He needed them for his survival, and they needed him for control.
This leads us straight to that critical, very high-stakes first meeting between Hirohito and General MacArthur in late September 1945. What exactly was on the line there, and why did the accounts of what actually happened in that meeting become so immediately contradictory?
Well, what was at stake was potentially everything. The emperor's physical survival, the survival of the imperial institution itself, and the entire political future of Japan. The meeting was held in deep secrecy, and almost immediately, MacArthur put out this narrative.
The famous one about Hirohito offering to take responsibility.
Exactly. MacArthur publicly praised the emperor's courage, claiming Hirohito had offered to take full responsibility for everything Japan had done during the war, even offering his own life if necessary. Now, this narrative was incredibly useful for MacArthur. It helped him sell the controversial idea of preserving the emperor to a very skeptical American public and government. See, this man is honorable, he's taking responsibility, we can work with him.
But the internal records, the interpreter notes, they tell a rather different story, don't they?
They certainly do. Accounts from the interpreters who were actually in the room suggest Hirohito's statements were much more vague, much more circumspect. He seems to have carefully avoided taking direct personal accountability for the war. Instead, he apparently suggested that judgment on responsibility should be left to future historians.
So less of a noble confession, more of a strategic move to ensure his own future.
It looks much more like a careful political negotiation. He successfully shifted the immediate risk away from his personal safety and onto the more ambiguous terrain of historical judgment. The public narrative we got was the one crafted by MacArthur to justify his strategic decision to keep the emperor. The reality was likely far more calculated on both sides.
But the ultimate fate of the emperor, and maybe the direction of the occupation, wasn't really sealed just by this one meeting, was it? It was overtaken pretty quickly by the massive shift in global power dynamics in the emerging Cold War.
Absolutely. The geopolitical context changed drastically and incredibly quickly. You had the Soviet Union expanding its influence in Eastern Europe and Asia. Then came the Soviet nuclear tests in 1949, a huge shock. And then the real game changer, the outbreak of the Korean War in June 1950.
Right across the water from Japan.
Exactly. Suddenly, Japan was transformed and Americanized. It went from being a defeated enemy that needed radical demilitarization and democratization to be an absolutely essential strategic asset, an anti-communist bulwark, a critical piece of real estate in the U.S. containment strategy against Soviet and Chinese communism in Asia.
And any thoughts of radical change, like abolishing the imperial system?
Were immediately abandoned. The priority shifted overwhelmingly towards rebuilding Japan as a stable, reliable, and implicitly, eventually rearmed ally.
And this dramatic geopolitical shift, it aligned perfectly with Emperor Hirohito's own personal agenda, didn't it?
It really did. Hirohito harbored a profound and very active distrust of communist powers, especially the Soviet Union. This deep anti-communist sentiment became the driving force behind his primary post-war goal, securing the long-term survival and stability of the imperial household. And the only way to do that, in his view, was to align Japan firmly and militarily with the United States.
Which put him immediately at odds with General MacArthur's initial vision for post-war Japan.
Completely at odds. MacArthur, at least initially, genuinely seemed to envision Japan as a kind of permanently unarmed neutral nation, a sort of Switzerland of Asia, maybe even a psychological weapon of peace, protected by the spirit of the newly written Article 9 of the Constitution, which renounced war.
But Hirohito feared that kind of neutrality.
He saw neutrality as creating a dangerous vacuum situation. He worried it would leave Japan strategically vulnerable, either to internal communist movements, which he greatly feared, or to external threats, particularly from the Soviets. So he actively, though secretly, sought a unilateral security treaty with the U.S., one that explicitly included permanent American military bases on Japanese soil.
And when he realized MacArthur wasn't fully on board with that idea, MacArthur still clung to the unarmed neutrality concept for a while.
Yes, MacArthur seemed to believe Japan's unarmed status, its commitment to peace via Article 9, was actually its greatest security guarantee. When Hirohito grasped this difference, he did something quite extraordinary for someone supposedly stripped of political power. He bypassed MacArthur completely. He engaged in secret diplomacy directly with Washington.
And this is where that really shocking Okinawa proposal comes into play. It demonstrates just how far Hirohito was willing to go, how much realpolitik calculation was involved.
It is an astonishing political move, especially given his supposed constitutional status. Starting around 1947, Hirohito began communicating directly with high-ranking U.S. officials. He used his liaison officer, a man named Terasaki Hidenari, as a channel to figures like William J. Sebald, who was the SKP political advisor, effectively MacArthur's diplomatic chief, but reporting also to Washington. He went completely around MacArthur's chain of command.
And what was the message he sent?
He suggested, quite explicitly, that the United States should occupy Okinawa and potentially other Ryukyu islands indefinitely, perhaps for 25 or 50 years or even longer, possibly under the fiction of a lease.
He was essentially offering to trade away Japanese territory. Okinawa had been part of Japan in exchange for a guaranteed long-term American military presence and security commitment for the main islands. That's an immense political gamble for a monarch who's supposed to be just a symbol.
It truly shows the depth of his personal commitment to the U.S. alliance, his intense fear of communism, and his astute awareness of America's own growing strategic needs in the Pacific. He was willing to compromise Japanese sovereignty over Okinawa to secure the imperial household's survival and Japan's overall anti-communist defense. This secret diplomacy was highly effective. It planted the seed in Washington that the U.S. needed a long-term physical presence and a formal alliance, directly undermining MacArthur's preferred policy.
And this hidden influence, this back-channel diplomacy, it continued right through the final crucial negotiations for the San Francisco Peace Treaty and the accompanying U.S.-Japan Security Treaty, especially with John Foster Dulles.
Yes, Dulles was the key figure here. Unlike MacArthur, Dulles was a quintessential Cold War hawk, an intense foreign policy realist. When he came to Japan in 1950 and 1951 to negotiate the treaties, he quickly recognized that the politicians, particularly Prime Minister Shigeru Yoshida, were in a difficult spot. Yoshida was politically constrained. There was significant domestic opposition in Japan to the idea of permanent U.S. bases, and especially to any hint of overt rearmament. Yoshida was reluctant to commit too publicly or too strongly for fear of backlash.
So Hirohito stepped in again, using his back channels.
Recognizing Yoshida's political weakness, Hirohito used his established channels to communicate directly with Dulles.
And what was the emperor's message this time? How did he sway Dulles?
He essentially communicated that the true opinion of the Japanese people, the deep-seated loyalty that ultimately flowed toward the Tenene, not the politicians, strongly supported the alliance and the necessity of American bases for protection against communism. He even reportedly used this leverage strategically, conditioning his full support for the treaty package on the quiet rehabilitation of certain pre-war officials, purged by the occupation, who remained loyal to him.
So he was acting as the informal, unconstrained guarantor of the deal.
Pretty much. He acted as the informal head of the country, assuring the Americans that the alliance wasn't just dependent on the current, possibly temporary, political leadership, but was guaranteed by the one figure who truly commanded the nation's underlying loyalty.
So the outcome, really, is that the monarch's secret interventions were actually crucial. They convinced Dulles and the U.S. side that their commitment to the U.S.-Japan alliance was anchored by the deepest symbolic authority in Japan, ensuring its long-term stability regardless of who is prime minister.
Exactly. And this whole dynamic set the stage perfectly for the post-occupation era after 1952. You have the 1947 Constitution, written under American pressure, which defines the emperor as merely a symbol of the state and of the unity of the people, explicitly stating he has no powers related to government.
A purely symbolic role on paper.
On paper. But this constitutional ambiguity, this removal from direct accountability, ironically created the perfect political cover. His symbolic role shielded him from direct political criticism. It allowed him to intervene, to influence, often with relative impunity, in ways that no elected prime minister could ever dream of doing.
And he clearly chafed at the idea of being just a symbol, didn't he? You mentioned that fascinating quote from the 1970s.
Yes, it's very revealing. In 1973, during some political turmoil related to military policy, he privately complained to his Grand Chamberlain, Ari Tsukabasa, and Ari wrote it down in his diary. Hirohito apparently said with some frustration, "So I am to be no more than a papier-mâché stage prop."
Wow. That quote really confirms his deep personal opposition to being truly separated from politics. He still saw himself as an active agent, someone with the right, maybe even the duty to influence policy.
It certainly suggests that. He didn't accept the purely symbolic interpretation of his role.
So how did the conservative post-war Japanese politicians actually use this symbolic feature? How did they create this continuous extra-constitutional channel for policy influence? How did this briefing system really work in practice?
The briefing system, the NISO, was the key mechanism. Conservative prime ministers Yoshida, Kishi, Ikeda, Sato, right through the post-war decades, they systematically reinstituted the pre-war practice of showing deep imperial awe. They needed that sense of stability, of historical continuity after the rupture of the war and occupation.
So they would go and report to him.
Yes. The system was simple but incredibly powerful. The prime minister, the foreign minister, sometimes other key cabinet members like the finance minister or the head of the defense agency would regularly visit the emperor, often weekly, sometimes even more frequently during major crises.
And what happened in these meetings? Just pleasantries?
Ostensibly, they were there to brief His Majesty on sensitive political, diplomatic, and military matters. But these were not just courtesy calls. They involved deep, substantive discussions on affairs of state. Now, the emperor couldn't issue a formal public directive. The Constitution forbade that. But his comments, his questions, sometimes just his expressed displeasure or concern during these private briefings, these were invariably interpreted by the conservative politicians who had been raised in the pre-war system of imperial authority as mandates, as signals from the informal but ultimate head of the country.
So if the emperor asks a pointed question like, why is progress on rearmament so slow? The prime minister hears that not as a question, but as a directive. Speed up rearmament.
Precisely. And we have numerous documented cases, based on diaries and memoirs of the participants, where his interventions during these NISO briefings seem to have directly altered the course of Japan's diplomacy and its security structure.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Take the critical issue of rearmament in the very early post-occupation period, say 1952 to 1954. Prime Minister Yoshida was being very cautious politically. He was slow-walking the idea of formal rearming, mainly because he feared a domestic backlash and potentially alienating Asian neighbors.
And the emperor pushed him on this directly.
Repeatedly, according to records. Hirohito apparently told Yoshida quite directly to rearm and revise the constitution to make it legal. He expressed his deep displeasure at the slow pace, and he even went so far, on at least one occasion, as to effectively override the prime minister's authority right in front of another cabinet member.
What happened?
During a briefing with Foreign Minister Okazaki Katsuo concerning negotiations about the return of the Amami Oshima Islands from U.S. control, Hirohito reportedly turned to Okazaki and openly criticized Prime Minister Yoshida's passive attitude on the linked issue of rearmament. He essentially told the foreign minister that the PM wasn't being proactive enough.
That is an incredible power play. He's basically acting as the commander-in-chief behind the scenes, critiquing the elected leader's policy to his own minister.
It certainly demonstrates that the emperor felt he still had the right, and perhaps the obligation, to guide the nation's military and security agenda, bypassing the elected officials if necessary.
What about foreign policy that wasn't directly about defense? Did he intervene there too?
Oh yes. We see a major intervention during the Japan-Soviet Union normalization crisis in 1955-1956. The prime minister then was Fuyama Ichirop, who actively pursued normalizing diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union. This was a move the U.S., deep in the Cold War, deeply distrusted.
And Hirohito stepped in to protect the U.S. alliance again.
Again, yes. He intervened to safeguard what he saw as the vital U.S. alliance. He personally warned his foreign minister at the time, Shigemitsu Mamoru, about the absolute necessity of cooperating closely with the United States to counter the threat of communism. And crucially, according to Shigemitsu's account, the emperor explicitly ordered him to carry this specific anti-communist message to his U.S. acquaintances, essentially, American diplomats and officials.
So wait, he was instructing a Japanese cabinet minister to act almost like a secret diplomatic envoy to reassure the Americans and implicitly counter the foreign policy direction of Japan's own sitting prime minister, all driven by his personal anti-communist stance and commitment to the U.S. alliance.
That's what the record suggests. It shows how his strategic calculation aligning with the U.S. against communism often superseded domestic political leadership or constitutional niceties. Furthermore, his influence also extended directly into the post-war military establishment itself, even though he no longer held the formal title of Supreme Commander.
How did that work?
Well, take 1973. During a routine briefing with the chief director of the defense agency, Japan's equivalent of a defense minister, a man named Masuhara Kikichi, the emperor gave him some guidance on military standards. He reportedly said something like, "I would like you to not imitate the bad points of the old imperial military, but take in the good points."
That sounds fairly innocuous, maybe just moral guidance.
Perhaps. But Masuhara clearly interpreted it as much more as an imperial imperative. He later publicly claimed that the emperor's words had inspired him to push extremely aggressively in the Diet, the parliament, for the adoption of the very controversial Fourth Defense Plan, which involved a significant military buildup.
And what happened?
It led to a political firestorm known as the Masuhara Incident. Masuhara was forced to resign due to the public outcry over revealing the emperor's involvement in defense policy. But the whole affair confirmed, inadvertently, Hirohito's deep continuing knowledge of military matters and his capacity to mobilize even high-level policymakers toward specific defense goals. His symbolic moral leadership was still potent enough to trigger concrete political actions, even scandals.
And he also weighed in directly on international treaties, didn't he? Especially ones aligned with U.S. policy, like the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT.
Yes, the NPT is another clear example. Japan signed it, but ratification was stalled in the Diet for years due to internal political debates and perhaps some quiet reluctance to fully close off the nuclear option. Hirohito explicitly pressed for ratification.
Why?
It aligned perfectly with U.S. policy, which aimed to keep Japan firmly denuclearized under the American nuclear umbrella. When the Diet continued to stall, Hirohito's clearly stated preference for ratification seems to have acted as an effective, informal directive.
How do we know?
The Speaker of the House of Representatives at the time, Meio Shigesubu, who was instrumental in finally pushing ratification through, later stated quite openly that he felt determined to carry out His Majesty's directives on the NPT, especially when the elected government seemed unable or unwilling to act decisively. It's another case of the symbolic power of the tenno being used to break a political stalemate, specifically in favor of U.S. strategic interests.
So beyond these behind-the-scenes briefings and directives, the emperor's symbolic power was also deployed much more openly, right out in public diplomacy, especially during moments of crisis that threatened that core U.S. alliance.
Absolutely. The massive turmoil surrounding the 1960 renewal of the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty is a perfect case study. You had huge, often violent, public protests against the treaty, which many saw as drawing Japan too closely into U.S. Cold War strategy and risking involvement in American wars.
And President Eisenhower was scheduled to visit Japan to sort of seal the deal, right?
Yes. The planned Eisenhower visit was meant to be the diplomatic capstone, a symbol of the renewed alliance. But the protests escalated so much, blocking streets, surrounding government buildings, that the visit itself seemed endangered. It became an existential threat to the conservative government's entire foreign policy framework.
And how did the emperor intervene publicly in that very heated situation?
Hirohito actively inserted himself right into the political debate. He publicly declared that it was his duty to welcome the president, no matter the danger.
Framing it as an imperial duty.
Precisely. By doing so, he demonstrated his profound personal commitment to the alliance, essentially siding with the pro-treaty government against the protesters. He was willing to put the imperial household right at the center of the political conflict, risking its symbolic neutrality and potentially facing civil unrest to uphold the alliance.
Did Eisenhower end up visiting?
No, the visit was ultimately canceled because the security situation was deemed too dangerous. But the very public involvement of the throne, Hirohito's willingness to put his symbolic weight on the line, was undeniable. It's a powerful message supporting the conservative pro-alliance position.
And this kind of symbolic diplomacy was used again years later, wasn't it? To repair damage caused by those sudden shifts in U.S. policy under the Nixon shocks of 1971.
Yes, the Nixon shocks were a major crisis in U.S.-Japan relations. Nixon's sudden opening to China, announced without consulting Tokyo, and his unexpected economic policy changes, like taking the dollar off gold, severely strained the alliance. There was a real sense in Japan of being betrayed or sidelined.
So how did the emperor figure into fixing that?
Both governments immediately recognized that the emperor's unique symbolic power was essential for repair. The U.S. needed a way to publicly reaffirm its commitment to Japan, to show that Japan still mattered more than China in their Asian strategy. So they specifically pushed for Emperor Hirohito to make a stopover in Anchorage, Alaska, on his way to a planned trip to Europe.
It's a stopover. Why was that so important?
Because it became much more than just a refueling stop. It turned into a high-stakes diplomatic event, a summit meeting between Hirohito and President Nixon. It was carefully orchestrated to stabilize the relationship.
And Hirohito used it strategically.
It seems so. He used the meeting not just to receive apologies or reassurances, but reportedly to actively secure a commitment for a proper state visit to the U.S. later on. This would serve as the ultimate symbol reaffirming the core structure of the U.S.-Japan alliance. American officials at the time explicitly noted that everything they did during that Anchorage stopover would be intensely scrutinized in Japan, judged by how respectfully they treated the emperor.
So leveraging the monarchy, showing respect to the emperor, became the ultimate proof of America's continued commitment to Japan. the one symbol that could transcend the political fallout.
Exactly. It showed that his symbolic capital was seen by both sides as the indispensable tool for alliance management, the ultimate measure of commitment, precisely because it stood above everyday party politics.
And all of this complex, often hidden, sometimes public imperial diplomacy seems to culminate in that highly publicized imperial tour to the United States in 1975.
Yes, the 1975 tour really was the ultimate expression, the capstone of post-war imperial diplomacy. It wasn't just a goodwill visit. It was deliberately pursued by both the Japanese government, often pushing against significant domestic political opposition who felt it was inappropriate or too political, and the American government.
Why was it seen as so necessary?
It was seen as the essential measure needed to finally salvage and decisively strengthen the entire bilateral relationship, which was still rocky due to ongoing trade tensions and the memory of the Nixon shocks.
And did it work?
By all accounts, it achieved exactly what both governments intended. It successfully solidified Hirohito's status, both domestically and internationally, as the respected informal head of state, capable of achieving concrete political results, in this case, alliance repair through purely symbolic means. That tour effectively cemented the modern U.S.-Japan alliance structure, validating decades of Hirohito's often unseen strategic political maneuvering. So if we try to synthesize this whole long arc, what we see is that the emperor's political influence throughout the entire post-war era, despite that constitutional mandate stripping him of formal authority, wasn't just some passive hangover from tradition. Not at all. It was an active, remarkably consistent, and highly strategic pursuit of his own specific interests. And chief among those interests, driven by his deep anti-communism, was the establishment and maintenance of the military alliance with the United States. He systematically used that extra-constitutional briefing system, the NISO, and leveraged the inherent imperial awe felt by many conservative politicians to advance very specific policy goals that ended up defining Japan's security posture for decades.
And if we wrap this whole narrative right back to where we started with the Kojiki, that compelling story of the divine emperor forged over 1,000 years ago, it provided the absolutely indispensable symbolic leverage, didn't it? The leverage that Hirohito himself and the conservative politicians around him used to navigate the trauma of total defeat, to stabilize a potentially volatile state, and then to establish the enduring foundation of Japan's modern geopolitical identity.
It really did.
That ancient narrative, in a way, is what transformed Japan from America's bitter wartime enemy into its most critical Cold War and post-Cold War ally in all of Asia. The emperor, it turns out, wasn't merely a symbol after all. He was a highly effective, if often invisible, policymaker who, through decades of subtle manipulation and potent symbolic diplomacy, profoundly shaped the nation's security structure and its place in the world.